So it's John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. After this, it was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up into Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem, by the sheep market, a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of important folk. The blind halt withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease they had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that place, he said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another one steppeth down before me. Jesus said unto him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto them that was cured, Is it the Sabbath day? It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered them, He that made the whole, the same said unto him, Take up thy bed and walk. Then asked him, What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away. A multitude being in that place. After Jesus findeth him in the temple, and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest the worst thing come unto thee. And the man departed, and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him whole. Lord will bless the reading of his word.
It's a privilege, isn't it, to have the word to be read in public. So many Christians would love to be gathered with brothers and sisters and just hear the word of God being read, and then deny that, and we need to not take these things for granted. Amen. I'd like to spend some time continuing our look through the Gospel of John. And again, this is probably out of the stories that we come across, the personal one-to-one conversations that we find in John. This is maybe one of the ones that is overshadowed, but just to remind ourselves of what Jesus has been doing and what John is recording for us. In John chapter 3, he met with Nicodemus. If you remember, he was one of the leaders, one of the main teachers of Jewish law. And Jesus took time to speak to him. In John chapter 4, he deliberately goes through Samaria because he wants to have a chat with a Samaritan woman by the well. At the end of John 4, somebody from a royal official from Herod's own household, he needs Jesus to minister to his son, but also to minister to him and his family as well. So Jesus takes time for them. And now in John chapter 5, we come across this paralytic, this man who is struggling by the pool of Bethesda. As I was thinking about it during the week, I thought that with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, you had people who were on the opposite ends of the theological divide, if you like. In Nicodemus, you had somebody who was well versed in the Jewish law, who knew the teachings of Judaism. And in the Samaritan woman, you had somebody who was considered to be ignorant of a lot of the truth contained within the Old Testament. And yet Christ ministered to both. He ministered to Nicodemus, the learned man, to the Samaritan, who the Jews would have seen as being somebody who was theologically unsound, And yet Jesus ministered to both. And then we saw with the court official, somebody at the top end of social society, if you like, as way as man thinks about social standing. And then you've got this poor beggar, this friendless beggar. And yet Jesus meets with both. And I think that John is trying to get that across to us, isn't he? That there isn't anybody outside of the scope of the ministry of Christ. There isn't anybody too important. There isn't anybody not important enough. There isn't anybody too wealthy and there isn't anybody too poor. There isn't anybody too learned and there isn't anybody too ignorant. It doesn't matter who you are. Jesus wants to meet you. Jesus wants to speak to you. Jesus wants to save you. And I think that comes across really strong at the start of this lovely gospel that we find here that John has left for us. So let's come and look at the story then about this poor beggar. It tells us where he is situated. It tells us that Jesus has gone down for one of the feasts to Jerusalem, and at one of the gates there, Bethesda, the sheep gate, there are 5 porches, and around these porches, many infirm people, well, they actually reside there more or less. Because at certain times, God in his mercy miraculously heals through stirring up of the water. It tells us this man has had his infirmity for 38 years. For 38 years, he has been waiting for somebody to minister to him. And for 38 years, he has been unsuccessful. Stop and think about that. It's a long period of time, isn't it? 38 years this man has been infirm. 38 years he has been hoping that it might be his turn next. And after 38 years, something changes. And what changes is Jesus comes. After 38 years, Jesus comes. It tells us in verse 6 that Jesus saw him lying there. And Jesus knew that he had been there all this time. The one who knows all, the one who sees all. It's no coincidence. Again, right throughout John, it's no coincidence the people that Jesus is meeting. It's no coincidence that Jesus has singled out this poor man. Jesus then says something to him which we might find a bit strange. At the end of verse 6, he simply says this: do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? You might think, well, what a silly question. Of course he does. But you see, Jesus never assumes anything. He never assumes anything. And once you have had this condition for 38 years, your whole mindset and your whole thinking about your potential and your life and what life is, the danger is that after those 38 years, you become accustomed to what you have. You become accustomed to your environment. And it is not to be assumed that this man wanted to be healed. As odd as that might seem to us, Jesus still wanted to hear from himself that he wished to be healed. Also, in asking the question, Jesus is stirring up faith within the man that there's an option that he can be healed. Because why ask, do you want to be, if you can't? Because Jesus doesn't tease us like that, does he? So he's asking the man, do you want to be made well? At this time, the man is still thinking about the environment and the situation that he has known for the 38 years. He is not seeing beyond what has been there all this time. And that is the frustration that he has with the poor being stirred up and him not being able to get to it. Remember, he is on a mattress for a reason. He is lying there because he cannot stand. And whenever the water is stirred up, it tells us in verse 7, I have no man to lift me and put me into the pool. That's why I said earlier he was a friendless beggar. Stop and think about it. There isn't anybody who is close enough to him that they are willing to wait with him to lift him into the water. Compare that to what we read in Mark chapter 2 verse 3 when we're reading about the paralytic who is lowered through the roof. Do you remember the story? His friends picked him up and the house is so full they go up onto the roof and they actually make a hole in the roof to lower their friend down. But it tells us there in Mark 2 verse 3 that 4 of his friends took him to Jesus. He was not friendless. He was in the same situation physically, but he wasn't in the same place emotionally because he was not alone. He still had friends who were willing to help him. And he had 4 friends who were willing to carry him on a bed, 4 friends who were willing to go and knock a hole in somebody's roof in order to get their friend to Jesus. But it talks to us of friendship, doesn't it? It talks to us of what they're willing to do for him. And compare that to what we read about this man. I have nobody. There isn't a single person who I can ask to come and help me. There is no man to put me into the pool. So when the water is stirred up, while I am coming, while he is crawling, while he is pulling himself, without power in his legs, he sees somebody else ahead of him step into the water. It doesn't matter if he saw it first, he cannot get there first. And yet, he didn't go anywhere else, because his only hope of being healed in his mind is by staying there. Imagine how he feels over that period of 38 years. His life has shrunk down, hasn't it? The mattress and this porch are his prison. He can't really go anywhere else. So when Jesus said to him, do you want to be healed? He desperately wanted to be healed. Because for 38 years he had stayed in the one place where he thought he might be healed. For 38 years he has had the frustration and no doubt the rising bitterness of seeing others around and about him able to either step in themselves or with friends able to be brought to the water. And then Jesus said something wonderful to him in verse 8. Jesus simply says to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. Today is going to be different for the last 38 years. Today is a different day. Because today, Jesus is there. Today, the one who has power to heal. Instantly. Immediately. And when Jesus asked him, did he want to be made well? In the man's response about all the frustrations of him not being able to get to the water, he is expressing to Jesus that he does have a desire to be made well. And Jesus responds to that cry. Rise, take up your bed and walk. That which had been a prison to him, that bed which had basically been the confines of his life, he now stood. And he could now step off that mattress, he could now step out of that prison, and he could roll his prison up and tuck it under his arm. What a lovely picture that is. This mattress that has restricted him and confined him, he now just rolls it up and he tucks it under his arm. No longer is the mattress having power over him. He has power over the mattress. His prison has been broken down. And Jesus tells him, take up your bed. You see, Jesus told him to do that. Jesus understood the significance of it. Jesus understood the power of that visually. This man who had been so powerless was now able to stand on his own 2 feet and was now able to roll up that bed and tuck it under his arm. How well known do you think he would have been after 38 years? Do you know people who are begging on a regular basis in a certain spot? Have you noticed them? Have you seen them? Are you blind to them? He would have been known within Jerusalem. He would have been known around the sheep gate. He would have been recognizable because he had been there for so long. And what an incredible testimony to the power of God when people who were used to seeing him lying on that bed, not able to do anything else, now see him walking around Jerusalem with that same mattress tucked under his arm. How many people that day met him and asked him, how is this possible? How are you doing this? You would have thought that it was going to be the loveliest day of his life, where people have wanted to know about how he was healed. And yet the sad thing is, that's not what he was challenged about. That is not what people wanted to talk to him about. It tells us in verse 10, the Jews. Now when you have that phrase, the Jews, it means those in a position of authority within Jerusalem. The Jews therefore said to him, who was cured? And what are they going to say to him? Who cured you? How are you walking on your feet? That's what you would have thought they said. But actually what they ask him in verse 10 is, it is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed. You can't believe it, can you? This man who has been a cripple on that bed for 38 years, when they see him walking, instead of saying, how are you walking after 38 years? How has this come about? They turn around and say, why are you carrying your bed? It's not lawful to do that. It's a Sabbath. You're not supposed to be working. You're not supposed to be carrying your bed. And I love the answer he gives to them in verse 11. He who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk. I'm not doing it because I think it's what should be done. He who healed me said to do it. And you can understand the implication of what he is saying to these religious leaders, isn't it? If he's had the power to heal me, well then I'm going to listen to his advice. If he has the power to heal me after these 38 years, if he has told me to take up my bed, then I will. And so they immediately challenge him in verse 12. Again, they don't want to know who's healed him. They don't want to know who has helped him. They want to know who has told you to take up your bed and walk. Who has dared stand against our authority? Who has dared tell you to do this? Now at this time, he doesn't know who it was. Because Jesus, under his wisdom, under his timing, Jesus decided not to reveal who he was to the man when he actually healed him. It tells us that Jesus had deliberately withdrawn himself. He had allowed himself to be lost in the multitude. No doubt the man would have been grateful and would have wanted to thank Jesus, but Jesus had deliberately withdrawn himself. So when this man is challenged about his healing, he is not able to tell them at that time who it was. All he can tell them is that it was the one who healed me. It was the one who had the power to heal. And he is the one who told me to take up the bed. Now the strange thing is, you would have thought that Jesus didn't want him to know, because Jesus didn't want him caught up in all that controversy. But oddly enough, in verse 14, we find that Jesus actually goes and looks for him. So initially, Jesus withdrew himself and didn't want the man to know who had healed him. And yet in verse 14, we read that Jesus found him in the temple. Jesus went looking for him. So again, it tells us this is all about the timing of God. It's not that Jesus didn't want him to know. Jesus wanted to decide when he knew. But he did want him to know. And why is that? Well, we find the answer in verse 14. Because Jesus wants to talk to him about more than just his physical health. When Jesus asked him, do you want to be made well? What he really said is, do you want to be whole? That's the word that he used. Do you want to be whole? Jesus meets up with him in the temple and he says, look, you are being made whole, but sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. With the paralytic that was lowered through the roof, Jesus forgave him his sins first. He allowed the people around to see that there was a bigger problem than the man's physical condition. There was the state of his heart. He needed forgiveness. He needed to be in a right relationship with God. And Jesus forgave him his sins first, and then he healed him. But as I always said, you can't put God in a box. You can't just say, because he did it that way once, he is obliged to do it that way every time. No, he is God. And with the paralytic that was lowered through the roof, he forgave him his sins first, and then he healed him. With the man at the pool of Bethesda, he healed him first, and then he sought him out to talk to him about the sin problem of his heart. You see, to be made physically well was great. But this man has another need as well. He needs to be in a relationship where he knows God as his Father. And the implication is that up until this time, he is somebody who has had little regard for God. Somebody who has lived a life that is self-centered. Odd to think, isn't it? That even in the situation that he was in, he could still have a heart that was closed to God. And Jesus wants to challenge him within his heart, within his spirit. Because Jesus wants him to be made perfectly whole. Not just physically whole, but spiritually whole. Jesus wants him to address this issue around rebellion towards God. Because that's what sin is. Outside of the forgiveness of God, we are in rebellion against God. And we need to subject to the sacrifice of Christ, the forgiveness that Christ offers, so that we can be forgiven sinners instead of rebellious sinners. And that is the challenge that Jesus leaves with this man. Don't live a life where you push God away, but open up your heart to him. Because there's worse things coming if we keep God at arm's length and we don't enter into the relationship that he would yearn to have with us. But isn't it lovely how Jesus sought him out twice? First, to meet his physical need, but then also to address his spiritual need as well. But isn't it lovely when we remind ourselves that God sees all of our needs and he seeks us out. Yes, physically, he helps us. Emotionally, spiritually, he helps us. He is there to minister to all of your needs, and his timing, well, it's always just perfect. And we thank God that he sees me, he sees you, and he knows us, and he knows all that we stand in need of. In Jesus' name.